Okay, hi, my name is Michelle Stofa. I'm the Research Communications Manager and Head of Editorial Services for Nemours, and they've asked me to give a brief talk about some grant writing tips as well as use of figures in grants. And I don't consider myself a grant writer. Our investigators write their own grants since they know the specific discipline, but I do review grants and I edit them. And what I've put together is just a couple slides of the most common corrections that I make over and over again. So some of them may be simple, but these really are things that we are changing over and over again. And when I give it back to the author or the investigator, I usually get a lot of aha moments. So those are my corrections. And then I'll have a couple slides just about use of figures in general. Most of the information will also apply to using figures in a manuscript or somewhere else. And again, they're the items that I most often comment for authors when I send something back to them that I've edited to tell them to correct to make it easier to read and more clear. Especially with grant writing, you want to make everything as simple as possible, as easy to read. At no point should your reviewer have to stop and reread what you've just done. Reviewers are usually reviewing more than one grant at a time, and we don't want to make it hard for them. You want to make it very clear, easy to read, and simple. And I know it's hard to do that with a lot of technical grants, but when we go through it, that's mostly what we're doing, is making things more simple for folks. Okay. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. General suggestions, and again, I'm just titling this the common edits, the things that I do to grants most often when somebody does give me their narrative. One thing I'll say from the beginning is we are happy to see any grants that you've written before you submit them. I don't see as many as I would like to. People don't usually say they have the time. However, I do have authors who send me every grant they work on, so it is possible. The more time you give it to me, the more I can do with it. But I also realize grants have tight time frames. So if you give it to me on a Wednesday and you're going to submit it on Friday, grants are my top priority because you're asking for money. So if you give it to me, I will even take it home and I will go through and at least give you a red line markup and give it back to you to make sure it's written well. And again, I do have some people who give me every one they work on. Okay. First point is just consistency in general. One of them is your specific aims. Say it the same way every time you talk about it. A lot of grants, that's one of the things I can pick up on, is maybe it's because you have multiple authors. Make it real clear you're talking about the same thing each time. Unlike prose or what I call PR writing or frou-frou writing, where you want to make things fancy each time, your aims specifically should be worded the same way each time. Same with use of terms. My example I've given is really more from papers that I've seen, but use of ultrasound versus sonogram. They're both the same thing. Pick one and stick with it. So throughout your grant, when you're talking about prior work, when you're talking about your background, use the same term for each thing. And that again may be because of multiple authors or just you're not seeing it, but that's something I pick up all the time. Your references. Use everything that's on the list and list everything in the text. I often find ones in the text that are not on the list, and I often find ones that are on the list that are not in the text. At best, it's going to look like you were sloppy and forgot to include them, or they got cut off. We don't want to look like you did not prepare well for this grant to be submitted and to be reviewed. Secondly, keep in mind, since your reviewers may be someone who's an expert in the field, it is possible that your reviewer may be one of your references. And this actually has happened with papers. And I have had authors tell me they have noticed that something was cited incorrectly and it was their own reference. So we don't want that to happen. So we will go through, if we look at a paper, and if you give us enough time, we're going to make sure at least everything is included and cited where it should be cited. The other notation, this happens with papers, but it's been mentioned in grants before. Before you submit it, make sure you're including all the most updated references in a field. You don't want a reviewer to come back and say you didn't include this. You don't want it to look like you're not aware of your field or what's going on most recently. Same thing with papers, but I've seen that come back a few times. Fonts, I get a lot of grants where it's all different kinds of fonts and nobody has picked up on it because more than one person has worked on it. It's as simple as just going through and making sure everything is consistent. Notes to authors. That's something that happens a lot. When I review grants for folks, I guess because you're talking to each other, more than one person is working on the grant, I'll find little notes to each other in there. And because you've looked at it so many times, you're not seeing it. If you are going to write notes to each other, whether it's with the edit feature or within the text itself, I would suggest you highlight it somewhere that you see it easily. Because I see a lot of times, more often than you think, I'll be reading the text and I'll note that there was a sentence that was meant to be addressed by somebody. We don't want those notes to be going on and have the reviewer see them, especially if it's a note that is not as positive as it could be. And that has actually happened in grants, and I've caught them, and then we made sure we got rid of those before it went on to its next level. Clear topic sentence for each paragraph. That sounds simple, but again, when a reviewer is reading your grant, you want them to understand it so clearly, there's no question about what you're going to be talking about next. So for each paragraph should have the first sentence telling what you're going to be talking about. Seems simple, but a lot of times I have to read through and it takes me a little while to figure out what you're going to be introducing. Avoiding jargon, excessive language, eliminate wordiness. This isn't any kind of technical writing. Manuscripts as well as grants. I have a couple examples. Instead of due to the fact that, you can use the word since or because. That seems like a simple difference, but it saves you 2, 3, 4 words. And if you're hitting a word limit, if you do that enough times, I've been able to go through grants and save someone a page if things are too long. Same with simple, short, and clear sentences. If your sentences are 5 or 6 or 7 lines long, and I have seen them that way in grants particularly, they're too long. You can say the same thing in 1 or 2 sentences, just cut it up into 2. That is probably the most common change that I make in most grant proposals that I see, is making things shorter and more clear. Okay. Spelling out acronyms at first use and use those consistently. That's a big one. That's in any technical writing again. Keep in mind that your reviewer may or may not be from the same discipline. They're going to be a scientist. So just spell them out the first time you use them so they don't have to wonder. I would even suggest doing that in different sections of the grant if it's really long, if you want to make sure they know what an acronym is, and use it the same way. So if you were talking about postmortem CT, and it's PMCT in one place, and then PMCT somewhere, if you're going to do that, just do it the same way each time. That is something I've pointed out to authors, that to me it looks like you're referring to the same term. But I could be wrong because it's not said the same way, so I pointed out to the author and then they go back and correct. We don't want there to be any reason in any grant proposal that your reviewer has to stop and reread what you just did. Active voice rather than passive voice. This isn't all technical writing, and this is where manuscripts are supposed to be going. It's kind of getting that way. You don't want to say an experiment will be developed. It is better to say we will develop an experiment. It's shorter, it's more active voice, it's more clear. The other thing is avoid what I call wishy-washy language. Not we would like to do this, just say we will. Once we have these materials, we will then do this step. It's not too bold, you're confident, you think you know what you want to do. Get rid of we wish to, we would like to, all that kind of wording. That's something I propose. In general, with tech, again, with any technical writing, specifically with proposal writing, if you're asking for money. If your writing is sloppy, they may question if your science is sloppy, and that came directly from somebody at the NIH. So show that you've taken the time to write it well and to prepare it, not only just meet all the formatting requirements and your page limits and your bio sketches, but that they can really understand what you want to say. You want to make it easy for the reviewer to know what you're saying. You want your idea, your science to stand out. What you're proposing, you don't want them to have to hunt for it. At no point should they have to stop and reread anything. And when I'm reviewing grants, that's what stands out to me. If I've got to go back and figure out up in paragraph 1 what they're saying in paragraph 2, and I realize I'm not a scientist, but I should be able to at least follow nouns and verbs and those kinds of things, that's something that I'm going to point out and say this seems to be unclear. And lastly, for general suggestions, if you have the time, and I hope most people can, again, we will do paper grants as soon as we can. This again came from an NIH workshop. Ideally, 3 people should review your grant proposal. someone in your lab to make sure you're representing what it is you want to say, another scientist that's from a different discipline, because keep in mind, your reviewer may not be from the same field that you're in. And I can actually name people who are really good grant writers who would probably be good to do that. And then thirdly, somebody like me who's simply an editor. I'm not looking for the science. I'm not looking for the significance of any of your data, but I'm looking for the fact that I can follow at least what you want to say. You give your background about what's known in the field, and you lead into what's missing, and then you're going to explain how your project's going to fill that gap, and you're going to show how your prior works give you the requirements to do that. Okay, any questions so far? I don't know if I'd be able to hear you. Okay. Now, that's just the common edits that I make to the papers, to the grants in general. I try to keep that brief, but those are the corrections I make most often. Now, they've asked me to talk about using figures in grants, and a lot of this also applies to using figures in manuscripts, most of the same information. The three main things are relevance, citing the figures, and formatting the figures. Some of this may seem simple, but these are definitely things that we change a lot when we look at a manuscript. And when I started looking online to see what other information I might want to include in here, these three items keep coming up about using figures in grants. A lot of the information was given by people who review grants. So this is what they want to see in figures. The relevance. Do you need the figure? Don't throw any figures in just because you want to put a figure in there. It needs to be important. Keep in mind what kind of figure it is to see what you want to show. Is it going to be a bar graph? Is it going to be a table? Use figures that are relevant. Don't just throw them in there. Be careful about repeating information in both the text and the figures. Your text can introduce it, and then the figure is going to show you the trend or the most important part. Did I have somebody with a question? No? Okay. Citing the figures in your grants. Every figure gets a title. Every figure gets a number. So don't just say, see figure. Number them all. Figure 1. And then it gets a title. Most of them get a legend. The legend will go at the bottom. Now, keep in mind, we want your figures to be able to stand alone, because sometimes your reviewer is going to take a look at your proposal, just like they would with a paper or perhaps with a poster. They may look at your figures first and see if they want to read the rest. So you want to make sure that if there are any weird abbreviations anywhere in your figure, spell them out in the legend. There's always room. They don't want to have to look back in the text to see what an abbreviation means or an acronym. So you're going to spell them out. Easy to do. If you have any figures, cite them all in the text. Every figure gets a sentence or two. We don't want any in there just because they look nice. It needs to be relevant. It needs to be important. The other thing I see a lot is, especially in grant proposals, they'll talk about a concept and then say, and figure shows this. It really should be the other way around. You want to say, as seen in figure 1, and then give the explanation. Again, it's more about being easier for the reader to follow what you're doing. Okay. Formatting. Figures in general. A lot of people like to get fancy with figures with shading and all kinds of cool stuff. Simple is always better. With a manuscript, with a grant, or anything that you have, again, it's going to be easy for the reader. This is not PR writing where you need to be pretty. You want it to be clear, and you want the science to stand out. Consider the type of graph or a figure versus a table. Whenever I start to see anything listed in text, if it's more than 2, 3, 4, 5 numbers, I start to wonder if they want to put a table in there. Color plus patterns. This is really interesting because I found this a couple different places when I was researching this. Color is always better. So if you have a bar graph, if you have a line graph over time, definitely use color, but keep in mind, sometimes these are going to be photocopied and passed around, so you don't want to use only color. So you're going to use, if you're doing a bar graph, use color, but also use patterns. If you're going to do a line graph, use symbols plus the lines. So your figures will be very clear whether they are printed in black and white or if they are printed in color. Make sure it's readable both ways. And keep them consistent. It's going to look much nicer if your figures use the same colors, use the same weights as you look through your document. You want to look like you took the time to prepare it. Okay. Figures, I'm talking things like bar graphs and line graphs. Yes, they get legends. When you create a legend, a lot of time, if you create it in Excel or in PowerPoint, the legend or the key ends up going in some weird place. Move it inside the graph. It's going to save you in spacing, and box it if you need to make sure you can see it. Again, to make it easier on your reader. Make sure you use your axes, your Y and X axes. You'd be surprised how often those things don't show up. Avoid using grid lines that go through your bar graphs and your line graphs. It just looks messy unless you need them. Unless you really need them, it's just going to make things look cluttered. Your figures are not going to really be that big in your grant. Line weights, do not rely on the default line weights when you're doing your figures. The default's not going to be, it doesn't look heavy enough when you're going to be doing this. So bring everything up. Don't rely on Excel or PowerPoint to give you things that the defaults are going to be dark enough for you that you can see. Same with fonts. Every figure that I work on a poster, on manuscripts, your fonts for your legends, for your X and Y axes, increase more than the default. Don't rely on it's going to come up really, really tiny. And I suggest for figures, especially to stand out against your text is probably going to be a serif like a Times Roman. I would suggest for your figures using a sans serif. It looks better when you're using a figure. It's going to be easier to read. Always label your axes, which you probably always do, but also include the units. Don't assume they're going to know the units. Again, it looks like you've closed the loop. So if it's milligrams or years or months or whatever, for both the Y and the X, make sure you put it in there. Lastly, again, with your figures, keep in mind they may review your grant proposal, and you want your figures basically to be able to stand alone. So that's why you want everything to be super clear. You want to make sure your abbreviations are explained. Everything has a title. Everything has a number. So they can link it easily in the text if they need to, but they also don't have to hunt in the text to find out what it is you're trying to say. And that's pretty much everything. Any questions? Okay, I actually can't hear you in here. I can only hear you down the hallway. Okay. Luckily, I have good hearing.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, hopefully it's one I can answer.
I think so. So pop this out. So the question came in from Eric. I don't think Eric has a microphone, so he couldn't chime in. But for those of you out there, Eric's question is, he often asking for your opinion on using we when writing a collaborative proposal and trying not to use I.
I would agree. I would agree. Yes, if you're part of a group, I would say we.
And then is it different for his thoughts or opinions? Does it vary by agency?
If you have an investigator to what's been do you find it varies by agency? That's interesting because I do see both. I've not seen one or the other. I'd have to see if there's one. No, I've seen both, and I've not seen that one or the other is preferred. If the PI is the one who has most of the clout, you could say the PI will. But if it's a group of you or if it's a collaboration, I would still say the investigators and keep that consistent.
So he's saying in general he uses
yeah. That's probably better. Yeah.
So it seems like from your
it's a better representation.
So most importantly is maybe the continuity of whatever. Yep. So okay.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I definitely wouldn't have any I in there. Yeah. And that would be in the same thing as in papers and that kind of thing.
Does anyone else have any questions?